I would like to thank Palm Communities, our lunch sponsor today and a sponsor of our entire conference, for being there for the CRA CAL-ALHFA conference this year. We really appreciate your sponsorship, and please do stand up. This is Palm Communities right here. It's a truism that we really couldn't have done it without you, and we really appreciate it. This is not quite the end of the conference. We still have one more flight of panels to do. This afternoon's sessions will be affordability through density, using California density bonus law to create affordable housing. We have the California Utility Allowance Calculator Training Workshop. And we have new BFFs, and for those of you who don't know, that's Best Friends Forever. Redevelopment agencies and housing authorities team up with great results. So we're almost there. We're looking forward to that last session of workshops before your safe journeys home. It is a real pleasure for me to introduce Joe Matthews, our luncheon speaker today. I was lucky enough to read Joe's book about a year ago. It's co-authored with a guy named Mark Paul. And I met Mark at a library dinner in Sacramento about a year ago. I was just really fascinated by this book. So when I saw, we're going to be in Anaheim, and Joe is a senior fellow at Irvine, this is a match made in heaven, and luckily he agreed and decided to come and join us. Joe's bio is very briefly presented in your program. He is the co-author of California Crack Up, How Reform Broke the Golden State and How We Can Fix It. He's a contributing writer at the LA Times, also at the Daily Beast. He's just getting started with a new project called Zocalo, which is fascinating on many, many levels. He may tell you a little bit about that. And he continues to be lead blogger on NBC's California site, Prop Zero. Some of you may have thought this is kind of an odd choice as a keynote speaker, since Joe has some pretty strong feelings about initiatives a la Prop 22. But let me read the descriptive blurb of the book, and then I will turn it over to him. Is California beyond repair? A sizable number of Golden State citizens have concluded that it is. Incessant budget crises plus a government paralyzed by partisan gridlock have led to demands for reform, even for a new constitutional convention. But what exactly is wrong, and how can we fix it? In California Crack Up, Joe Matthews and Mark Paul provide clear and informed answers and innovative solutions that allow Californians to debate their choices, settle on the best ones, hold elected officials accountable for results, and choose anew if something doesn't work. Concise, lively, and provocative, California Crack Up offers something new, a genuinely democratic operating system for the state. Available autographed copies, $20 each. Joe?
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I'm particularly delighted to be in Anaheim, which has always been a place that in my family represented not just fun, but a measure of success. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was an Okie, Dust Bowl type, came out here, found work, as so many folks did, the aviation Okies, they called them, in what we now call aerospace, at North American Aviation, which later became Rockwell. And this is a woman who not well educated. I'm writing about her and just obtained her high school grades, which were C's and D's, but managed through work, through ability to educate herself, and the opportunities that California had to eventually afford a house here in Anaheim, just off of State College Boulevard, where I spent some of the happiest times of my childhood. And every Christmas Eve, that was the good day to go to Disneyland. Apparently not a lot of people are at Disneyland on Christmas Eve. I don't know if that's still true, but that was the tip in the not so long ago. I'm here that's sort of one of my California stories, and I'm really here to talk about stories. And this book is based on a shared feeling my co-author and I had about the stories we tell ourselves in California. And I think this group, as much as any group I could imagine speaking to, knows of what I'm about to say. When you think about all of the stories we hear in our political discourse and our campaigns, when people talk about California and what's wrong with it, when you think about the sort of stories and explanations you hear, all of those stories are stories about blame. They boil down to blame. The legislature, this particular politician, this particular governor, this public employee union, this corporation, this group of people that, I hear all the time that there are these things called redevelopment agencies, and they're stealing from the education of children, and they, and are somehow ruining the state budget, and if we just did something about them, we would have this magical thing called realignment. Everyone sort of comes in for blame. Those are the stories that we tell ourselves. And Mark and I are very different kinds of people. Mark's one of those, narcissistic baby boomers. I'm, one of those, Gen Xer type slackers. Mark lives in Sacramento. I live in Los Angeles. Mark is came to the state for his education. I'm a fourth-generation Californian. Mark worked in politics and government. He was the deputy treasurer of the state. I'm totally unsuited for any kind of public service. We have these very different views. Even when he was in the newspaper business, he was an editorial writer. I have a greater respect for facts. I was on the news side, But we had this shared view that these stories, that this kind of narrative that underlies all the stories was wrong. That all these stories we tell ourselves some of them were true once, but they become outdated. Some of them were never true. And that the combination of the stories, which were all about blame, were really, took us off in the wrong directions, pitted us against each other, and made it impossible for us to even define and understand the fix we were in. So we decided to get together, these two very different people, and try to have an explanation, give us a new story that was sort of more accurate, that explained things, and I think, and I'll get to this more at the end of the presentation, I think explains some of the difficulties you've been having, and I think suggests a way forward for you, if I might most humbly say so, which is not very different than the way you are, the path you're currently pursuing, which is to fight, and that's the right path. But let me try to tell this story in a way that's that I think is easier to remember, easier to tell, is more accurate, more complete. And to know that story, I think you first have to understand the history of California, which is a peculiar history, and particularly when we talk about governance in California, how governing works, how politics works, we're not like the other states. Still the best book written about California, California Crack-Up is the second best book, but the best book ever written about California is still in print, was published in 1949 by Carey McWilliams, called California the Great Exception. It's a very easy read still today, and it talks about California having this peculiar history of being this incredibly fast-paced place where of this great suddenness, where everything happened fast. Decisions, often monumental ones, were done very, very quickly, and we've never had a great culture of deliberation, taking our time. That's not us. People always came to California with big outsized dreams. They didn't come to make better government. And that's reflected in our history, and that explains a lot of the system we have. We basically have had 5 moments of big moments in our history that sort of explain the governance we have now, and let me give you the 5-minute version of those 5. First, we started with a constitutional convention before we became a state in 1849. Very irregular kind of thing. It was called, with no authority, no really legal authority behind it, the military governor of the state, soldier from Maryland named Bennett Riley, called it. It was basically 50 guys in Monterey. Most of them hadn't been in the state very long. They listed all kinds of professions, but they were almost all miners at the time, for obvious reasons, and they were most eager to get out of there and go back to looking for gold. So what did they do? They took the Constitution of Iowa, because it was the shortest constitution, and it was the one that was most recent, had been most recent, one of the most recent, and they copied it. Though they took out almost everything in it that explained how you paid for government. There was a subcommittee of the group that was actually charged with trying to figure out how are we going to come up with the funds to have a state government, assuming that, soon the feds will make us a state. And that group reported back as follows. Most of the people here in California, they're poor, so you can't get any money by taxing them. The people who are rich, their wealth is in gold, so it's going to be hard to get any, real money out of them. And, it's going to be hard to even hire tax collectors because everyone wants to be going out looking for gold and making their fortune. So let's punt. Let's borrow some money now, and maybe when we become a state, Washington will help us out. And, you can see we've evolved so much in our thinking in 160 years. So that Constitution was so problematic, that quick fix was so problematic that there were immediate efforts to fix the Constitution, multiple attempts in the first 30 years of our history to get a constitutional convention, though we were wary of that. But in 1878, voters agreed to have a constitutional convention, and we had one that began in late 1878 and went into early 1879. And that's really the second of these 5 moments. And that was a very poorly organized, difficult, controversial convention. So a group of labor interests, a sort of labor party from San Francisco was a dominant force in that. But what everyone agreed on in that Constitution, the one area of real strong agreement, was that the problems of California were, primarily the fault of the Chinese. And so what we got there was a big article of the Constitution that was devoted to discrimination against the Chinese and was, a problem for not just our state, but for American foreign policy for 50 years after that. And then the rest of the document was sort of put together in this very strange way where everyone kind of got to make 2 suggestions. And after fighting a lot and putting the delegate from Santa Barbara on trial for 2 weeks in the middle of it and doing a lot of other strange things, they got to day 127, the first time they were going to sit down and put all the different suggestions, everyone's 2 suggestions, and together and edit into a coherent document. And they got about 15 minutes in the transcript. There's actually a transcript that survives. You can find it on Google. 1,500 pages, which I had to read. And they get into this, and they're starting to edit, and then people start raising their hands and say, I'm tired. This is day 127, and the per diem ended on day 100. My wife misses me. My farm is falling apart. I got to go home. And so they vote to adjourn without reading the thing through even once. Now, that was a great disaster. That document was so fundamentally problematic, including, having multiple articles of the same number and just basic copy editing problems, that we spent the next 60 years aggressively amending the Constitution. More than 300 amendments to the Constitution between 1880 and 1940, first with the legislature referring things to the voters, and then once we got the initiative process in 1911 as a constitutional amendment, we began to do a lot of amendments that way as well. It was a very odd way to rewrite a Constitution because it was one measure at a time, one amendment at a time, one piece at a time, often one silver bullet at a time, in campaigns that sound very much like the campaigns today. Let's do this, let's stop the politicians, let's do this one thing, and other things will fall into place is always the logic. It's the logic of the silver bullet. Now, that's that. So that wave of 60 years of amendments, kind of that third of the 5 moments. Now, that left us with such a big, nutty, unwieldy Constitution, a lot of strange things in it, that we had a process in the 1960s, the Constitutional Revision Commission, which was charged with shortening the document, taking out things that weren't really constitutional in nature. And that they had some success. They got about 16,000 words out of the document. But that's sort of the 4th moment, but we're now in the 5th moment. Since the 1970s, with some changes in the initiative process, with some changes in our politics, we've seen another wave of constitutional amendments, both put on the ballot by the legislature and those put on the ballot via the initiative process. And we've done, another big wave of amendment upon amendment upon amendment. often Prop 13 is one of those, but not the only one. I sort of see Prop 13 as a kind of a base of an operating system on which all kinds of interests and people across the spectrum have built different contraptions with the best of intentions to sort of make the best of what they can in this system. And I would suggest, the way I see something like Prop 22 is not as something as ideal, but something as a practical, bit of self-protection that groups of people have had to take. That we've had a lot of that. That's a lot of the last 30 years of our history. So with those waves, and that way of doing things, two bad 19th century conventions and then one at a time changes, what's sort of missing in that story, what we've never had is sort of a moment of design. We have this system that we've all contributed to in some way or shape or form if we've been voting, but that no one ever designed. No one. It's not a development. It's not a redevelopment project where all the different pieces were put together. It's not a affordable housing project where someone tried to make all the pieces of the project fit together, the finances and everything. We've never had that moment to decide. We've had, slapdash 19th century and then one at a time measures. So what has that left us with? What is the nature of this system that we have? Now that's a very hard question, and Mark and I, in trying to answer it, did what everyone does in the 21st century when confronted with a very difficult question, and that is we hired a consultant. And our consultant, we wanted something different. We wanted a consultant with a big, broad perspective to really give us a new story of what this system is. And so we decided to look outside of California, outside of the United States, in fact, outside of planet Earth, and we hired an extraterrestrial consultant. And E.T., we wanted E.T. Can you stand up there, E.T.? Thank you. E.T., but this is not just any E.T. This is the Alexis de Tocqueville of the universe. This is an extraterrestrial who's familiar with all of the political history and systems of government and political science all around the universe. And here's what E.T. reported back to us, after some visits around the state. This is a very strange system, California, and I've never seen anything quite like it. It's not even one system of government in California. You sort of have three. Now, on one hand, you have an election system, the way you pick people to serve you at the state level. And, that system is not without precedent. It's essentially the British system. It's a system that English-speaking people on your planet use. It's essentially a system of single-member kind of elections. You have a legislative, your legislative body, you elect people, one district, one person to represent that, and the winner is whoever gets the most votes. And that's a system that has the merit of it is that it's a very strongly majoritarian system. It can turn a small number of votes into a legislative majority that has some legitimacy. Now, what's a little peculiar about your system is its size relative to your state. Since you haven't resized your legislative body since 1879, when there were fewer than 1 million of you, and there are now almost 38 million of you, you have some of the largest and most populous districts anywhere. Your people represent more people than anyone in your country. In fact, your assembly members represent 3 times more people than the legislators in the state with the next largest, most populous districts, Texas, and 10 times more than the national average. So when your people feel frustrated, they feel distant from their government, they feel unrepresented, it's actually a matter of mathematical fact. You actually get less representation in California than anywhere else, and that's a bit strange. But that system is majoritarian, that's a principle, and it's a strong one. So that's not your first system. Now, there's a second system. You send these majorities you elect in this majoritarian system, very large, weirdly sized, into a second system of your governing system. Really, a lot of government is about money and spending and taxes and fiscal stuff. And there you have a system that operates on a completely different principle than your election system. I mean, you have so many rules, special spending mandates, and it's a budget ratchet with, whips and chains and tax limits and spending mandates and all these different special rules, supermajorities and what have you, more than any other state in your country, in fact, and you look very different in this area than the states that are judged best managed on fiscal things in your country, like Virginia and Indiana and Wisconsin, which have almost none of these kinds of rules in their constitutions or in initiative statutes. There's so many of them that essentially you have a system based on a very high level of consensus. I mean, you could even call it minority rule. The minority party or big interest groups have all these kinds of levers to block things and stop things from happening. So you need broad consensus to do much of anything. Now, whatever you think of your particular interest groups, your particular politicians, it would be nearly impossible to have really good, effective, responsive governance in a state that has these two systems, an election system and a governing system, that operate on these two completely contradictory principles. Those things are not designed to work together. So that would be very difficult. But it's even more difficult because you, on the third hand, and you know, that's why we get the ET, you know, third hand, you have this other system that that throws lightning bolts into the other two, and that's your initiative and referendum system, and that is the most inflexible system of initiative and referendum anywhere in the known universe. I mean, the ET told us he had been to galaxies all over. He had seen, you know, the United States, the Earth, and other galaxies, and there is nowhere else with an initiative system this inflexible. Once you know, there's most other places that have this process in the known universe allow some flexibility, the ability to fix errors in the front end of the process without having to start all over, the ability to pull things off the ballot when initiative sponsors and legislators and governors make deals. In Colorado, in two of the most recent cycles, multiple measures were pulled off the ballot after there were compromises. In one case, after the ballots themselves were printed. You have none of that flexibility on the front end that encourages people to compromise and make politics together, which is one of the virtues of having direct democracy in most places. And on the back end, you're the only place where when the voters do make a law by initiative, they can only undo it except they can't be undone by the legislative body except by another vote of the people, unless, of course, the original initiative has language permitting that kind of amendment. That makes you very unusual. That makes it a powerful process, but an inflexible process, and one that allows you to throw lightning bolts that make it even harder for the people elected in the majoritarian system but governing in the consensus system to do much of anything. So you can blame whoever you want. You know, you may not like your redevelopment agencies, but it's not their fault. You know, California doesn't work because you put three systems together that don't belong together. They don't fit together. California doesn't work because it can't work. Now, we accept the ET's diagnosis, and I think if you do too, it's a healthy diagnosis because it's accurate, it's complete, and it points the way to the kind of conversation that we need to have and what we actually need to do to fix the system. And that conversation is a conversation about integration. You know, how do you take these, I mean, we're going to have elections, we're going to have governing systems, and I think we're going to have initiative and referendum, but how do you design these things? Have that moment that we've never had in that 160-year history of design, where we sit down, all of us, and try to make the pieces fit together and get something we want. And there's a lot of good news about that. One bit of good news is, when you're so poorly structured as California is, almost every other state and most of the democracies of the world provide a model for us that would be an improvement upon what we have. So there are lots of good choices. You don't have to die on one particular set of mixes. A lot of people do a better job of design, many times because they've had more recent moments of design than we've had. We've never really had one. The second thing is, in other areas of our life in California, things that don't have to do with politics and government, we're very good at integrating. I mean, California is you know, people talk about the different divides in California, but it's a remarkably integrated human society when you look around the world. Our families are profoundly integrated, our culture, you know, our economy, our technology, we're a pretty integrated bunch. I mean, you know, the Korean barbecue tacos, that's us. Who else could have come up with that? The iPhone, when you look at it, people talking a lot about Steve Jobs. The iPhone is full of technologies and things that worked, that come from around the world, come from different places. They were designed here together into something very useful. It's something we actually know how to do. We just haven't done it in governance. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. Now, I wanted to just leave it there and say, go out and integrate, but Mark, you know, the more serious policy guy of us, felt that we should offer one solution ourselves, one way of doing this. So we do this in the book. What we're not as adamant about our particular way as we are about how we define the problem in the way the ET does. But this is the little bit of the wonky part of the talk, so I'm not going to belabor too many of the details. But we do offer one way in the book about how we would integrate. And our view is essentially to take things that work in other parts of the world and in other parts of the country and try to use them here. We actually try for as vanilla a system, as close to sort of the middle and the average when you look at global democracy as you can get, in part of the theory that Californians are plenty crazy themselves, so you don't need a really big, complicated system. You want to make things as simple as possible, and you want to respect what the geography of California is. So we take the first election system and we redesign it in ways that, in the way that most countries, most democracies have moved towards, which is a system that doesn't use single member districts, but a system based on multiple member districts. And you can do this a lot of different ways, where the people in multiple member districts are elected with some measure of proportional representation. I won't get into all the wonkiness of it. If you have questions about it, I can explain it. But, and we think those multiple member districts, the districts of the state, should not be these randomly carved things, which are carved either by politicians or redistricting commissions, but they should be the regions of the state. So, each region would be a multi-member district. We're really people of regions. That's our, mode of citizenship. Our commutes are regional. Our lives are regional. Our sports teams are regional. Our media are regional. I mean, my 2-year-old, who, I live here in Los Angeles, he's a Dodger fan. If anyone says San Francisco Giants in his presence, he boos. So the regional feeling starts early. It's baked in. So regional districts make sense. That's they're easier to follow. People know what region they live in. They don't often know what assembly district or Senate district they live in. And when, so the example is if you're in the Bay Area and say there was a Bay Area regional district and had 20 seats in it, and the Democrats got 70% of the vote and the Republicans got 30% of the vote, you'd send 14 Democrats and 6 Republicans to Sacramento from the Bay Area. Why do you do that? Well, a couple reasons. First, it actually creates real political competition everywhere. So right now, you're a Republican in the Bay Area, you show up to vote in a legislative election, you're wasting your time, your candidate's not going to win. But in that kind of system, the party and you have an incentive to have an agenda, to argue, to participate in the politics, because every vote you get gets you that much closer to an additional seat. You have to compete everywhere. You have to have political conversation everywhere. We basically don't have legislative elections, so that's good. We also think that's a flexible enough system that you could actually have real change in the composition of the legislature, not more than just 1 or 2 seats, which is considered almost an earthquake in this in our state. But you have a real change, and the minority party would have a real chance of getting back into power. The current system actually works very much against the Republicans now. The Republicans get a much higher percentage of the votes cast in legislative races than their percentage of representatives in Sacramento. They would be close enough that if they competed everywhere, had a compelling thing, that they could actually win back power. And we think if you have a system that's like that, that's fair and there's real competition, then you can do to the second system what we suggest doing, which is basically dismantling it. Taking out all the special spending, tax, supermajorities, all those rules, and undoing that. So we don't, so we go back to sort of majority accountability, and we go back to something I want to talk about a little bit later in the context of redevelopment, which is true local control, where locals make the decisions about the programs that they manage and spend money on. They also make the decisions about raising revenues for them, which is a sort of a core principle, we think. And then thirdly, we would take the initiative and referendum process and do various things to it, mainly to make it look like the process works in the German states and Switzerland. Switzerland is actually what inspired us to do this 100 years ago. That's where our process comes from, where the process is much more integrated with our governance. It's actually on a separate election cycle. They don't vote on candidates and long lists of measures at the same time. They vote 4 times a year by mail ballot on a calendar that sort of is tied more to the governing calendar, the parliamentary calendar, because that's the they treat these things as though you're making laws, not as though they integrated with their government, not with their politics. We have a system much more integrated with politics. They do some things that bring the legislature into the process without taking away the final say of initiative sponsors to take something to the people if they don't like what a legislature proposes in negotiations. A lot of this integration, I can get into more details, that gets pretty wonky pretty quickly. But that's one way. We think that our sort of integrated system would at once give more power to our elected officials. They'd have more discretion and ability to roam, but within a system that gave us more power to kick them out of office, real power to kick them out and their party out of office because of the changes in our election system, and a different kind of initiative referendum system. We're particularly high on making it easier to referend things, to stop things the legislature does, make it easier for us to stop things, so that both sides would have more power, but in a way that forced them together into more interchange. But anyway, let me stop the wonky part of this conversation then, and at that point, and switch gears a little bit to talk a little bit about how to think about the redevelopment and the controversy and the legal stuff that you're all tied up in, given this sort of explanation and this kind of thinking about where we should go. Essentially, there's a chapter in the book that talks about local government. And one of the sort of the whips and chains and supermajorities of that second system, having all those rules, has had, as everyone in this room knows, the power of centralizing a lot of fiscal authority at the state level. And one advantage of taking away a lot of that stuff would be to return power to the local level. Now, you should be skeptical of anyone talking about realignment. You've had this experience, and you I think got on the business end of what to us looks like phony realignment, right? I mean, we can have an argument about the particulars of how redevelopment works or doesn't work in different places and all its problems, but reality, redevelopment and its growth has been a very rational and reasonable response to this system. Local communities and places want to have, they don't have a lot of tools. In fact, they've lost a lot of tools over the last 30 years with centralization to take control of their own destiny. And redevelopment is one of the tools out there. Local communities should have more tools, but it's one of the tools that they're able to use and do. It makes complete sense to protect it. It makes complete sense to fight for it in the context of this kind of system we have that the ET talks about. So what you so when you get picked on, when you become one of those stories of blame, as essentially the governor made you a story, and us in the media helped out a little bit, you become this sort of, it's a great example essentially of what happened to you, of how we have attempted to fix the system, which is not to redesign the whole thing, but to pick on one thing. We're going to stop or change this one thing. That's essentially that whole constitutional history. Our initiatives, our moves have been this attempt to pick on one thing, to try to stop it, to change it, and hope that that will lead to some sort of sea change. You got on the business end of that. That was unfair, and it's sort of a great example of how it didn't work, right? You're still here. The state still has a tremendous budget problem, and whatever they would have done to you wouldn't have actually made much difference in that budget problem. So it's a great argument that essentially your experience, I think, makes an argument against what has been the pattern and continues to be the pattern as you see reform initiatives come before us now for 2012, which is to fix this thing one at a time. I wrote newspaper stories for a long time where the moral of the story often was this politician wasn't incremental enough. He or she bit off more than he or she could chew and was too ambitious. And they should have learned that things are incremental. And I believe 99% of the time that's how change has to happen, bit by bit, half a loaf, quarter loaf at a time. Unfortunately, California in this moment is in that 1%, where all we've done is the incremental over our time. We've never sort of had the moment of design. So when we get into a fight in redevelopment, we're still sort of fighting over kind of constructs and different rules, and it's a fight within the system where in some sense there are some people are more winners than others, some people are more losers than others, but nobody wins. We need a comprehensive solution. So, so it is completely rational to fight like heck in the courts and with the ballot initiative process within the context of the system to protect, what for local communities is one of the few tools they have. I would hope, though, that in the second part of that conversation is, if the state is ever serious, if people in the state are ever serious about really comprehensively redesigning and really returning real authority and responsibility, particularly the ability to produce revenues, which is at the heart of politics, right? Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. And local politics is all about taxes and arguing about who's going to pay for things. And when you take that away, and we've taken a lot of that away in California, you lose engagement, and you lose control, and you lose accountability. Because there's no better way to hold people responsible than to give them the power to tax. That keeps people watching them. We've lost a lot at the local level, the business and the taxpayer representative. We don't have as many people who would sort of come from the business community, come from what you might call sort of the taxpayer sector, looking at local government, because local government and local elected officials don't have the same power to raise revenues as they did, more than 30 years ago. Bringing that power back actually brings greater accountability because it means more people are watching you. And it forces you to make decisions that, an accountability. I think some of the greater spending problems we've had on local level, with some of the more outlandish pensions, for example, wouldn't happen if those local elected officials had to set the tax rates and defend the tax rates to their voters in the way that they, but they don't. They essentially don't. It's very easy to spend money in that situation. So, anyway, sorry to ramble on too much in this, but I think for redevelopment, what this means is, your fight is just in the long term, in the short term, because you need the protection, you need control, but but my hope is that if there's ever a process, and it looks like there's going to be a process that will be a moment of redesign where true local control is reestablished, that's something worth signing on to. That's what you're fighting for is second best, and you know it. But that's sort of where I come down and look at this. Let me close on a different question, because I think it's probably the most obvious question is, how is this going to happen? Why is any of this sort of real? And why now? We've gone away with this for 160 years. We've never had a really great system of government. We've been very successful because, honestly, governance isn't everything. And I would say that there's a big change in California that's happening now that is different and new in our history, and that means that we have to do this. We've always been this very blessed state, a sort of never land, where waves of people and wealth came to us, via gold, via oil, sunshine, the military-industrial complex, in my family's case, something that sort of pushed us forward. And that can't happen now. We're too big. And for the first time since in our history as a state, we've always, for 160 years, we've been a place of arrival, where most of the people living here, middle-aged people settled here, were actually from somewhere else. They were from another state or another country. But we're now at the point where we're having for the first time a homegrown majority. When the people who are now in their teens and 20s get to middle age, the majority of them will be from California. So in some ways, we've been the New York Yankees. We're able to kind of get talent from everywhere else, and we have to be, more the Dodgers before this era. We have to grow our own, and that means we can't get away. We're going to have to fix some of these governance problems that we've sort of gotten away with not fixing for a very long period of time. That's a profound change, and it means that we have to sort of sit down and get this right. And while it seems like a very hard thing to do, and what I'm talking about procedurally is a constitutional convention or a constitutional revision commission, some sort of process, it's actually much easier to do things that way. When we sit down and you look at the whole document and try to put things together, than to try to fix this thing one one initiative, one ballot measure, one constitutional amendment at a time. What we're doing now is essentially, for those of you from the San Jose area, we're living in the Winchester Mystery House, and our initiatives, however nice they sound, however beautiful the room that they might build is an extra room on the house, and we really need to remodel the whole house. So anyway, let me stop there. Thank you very much, and I'd love to entertain your questions.
Okay, we have time for questions, about 5 or 7 minutes, but I also want to mention to you again, Joe did bring some books. I already bought one, and he's autographed it for me. And so after our session here, if you could be at our registration for a little bit.
I'd be honored.
And just wanted to give you a heads up on that. David, you have a question?
Joe, last year, the Bay Area Council and other groups were in the throes of many initiatives that are in line with what you're talking about, the big change. Haven't heard much about it the last 12 months. What's going on?
Well, a couple things. I mean, there was an effort, and they basically didn't come up with the money, despite lots of people on the Bay Area Council and companies in the Bay Area Council having money to go forward. Some people say there were sort of threats that came out of from Sacramento to don't do this, don't pursue this. There was some internal dissension in the group, and so that idea is dead. And a lot of the people that have gone into the sort of I think sort of the California Forward camp, which is to make, or Think Long Committee. Everyone know about the Think Long Committee in this room, funded by this homeless billionaire, Nicholas Bergeron, who, doesn't have a home. He just lives in beautiful hotel rooms. I actually visited with him for 3 hours in the Peninsula Hotel. It was the first time I've ever been in the Peninsula Hotel without being escorted out by security. As an LA Times reporter, we used to try to go into fundraisers, and we kind of expected to get kicked out. I think the feeling, the incrementalism attitude is really there, but I really feel like as long as you're in incrementalism, folks like you who are trying to just make their communities better are going to be in this sort of constant fight mode, whether it's via the ballot or in the courts, where you're ultimately really just playing defense. And we can never get to the point that way where we're playing offense. And it's, I know it's scary, a convention, but, we wouldn't agree on a lot if everyone was there, and that's good. We'd end up with a lot shorter document. I mean, heck, if it's a real problem for people to do it, take the United States Constitution. Everyone thinks that's a great thing. Some people think it was divinely inspired. And, take out the stuff that's sort of federal and just adopt that is the California Constitution. It's 1/20th the length. It's a lot simpler, and it would leave a lot of the questions that should be left for negotiation and democracy to our politics. So, I think we'll continue to fail and fight for a number of years. I'm the pessimist. Mark's more optimistic. He thinks we're in the crisis that's going to precipitate the big change. But I think we'll fight for a number of years until we run out of things to do, and we'll just sort of have to do this.
Question.
Do you think the parliamentary system offers a viable model for California?
I don't know that we can do that. What I'm suggesting in terms of regional districts is if the region would have to be defined in a way that, there was the ratio of one representative to, number of population was the same everywhere, sort of one person, one vote. We do have some history of that in the country. Illinois had proportional representation in multi-member districts for most of its history until these Daley guys came to power, and there was actually an initiative in 1980 that ultimately finished that in Illinois. I don't know. I think the particulars of the system are less important. We get so hung up on the particular initiative or the particular policy than the fact that the whole thing hangs together. Making the design work the whole is more important than the particular parts. We're so fixated on the parts. I could do this 25 different ways, essentially, but I think parliamentary stuff that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm still suggesting just a different kind of election with with different sorts of rules, but not a parliament that would rise and fall as they do.
Other questions? Okay.
So, a lot of what we do, the provision of affordable housing, is because other money comes with strings attached, like doing affordable housing.
Right.
And I think a lot of people, if they're honest in their local jurisdictions, would think without the mandate to do it, it wouldn't happen. And that's also I think it's kind of tied to that whole issue about if you had more control over paying taxes, you wouldn't want to pay them, and you'd still want the same level of services. And so I'm just wondering if you just have a lot of confidence in people, the enlightened, whatever, I don't know if it's even what happens at the local level when things are devolved down and there's a lot more access.
I don't have a ton of confidence. I don't say this out of a huge confidence in local government. It's more of a conviction that, that if you're going to have big decisions made for you, they should be made in a place that you can get to without getting on a plane. That's essentially the core principle. Like California is so problematic as a state, is its size and scale. You hear people say, this is the 8th largest economy in the world, but the more interesting statistic is that if we were a country, we would be the 35th largest country in the world, and all 34 countries bigger than us have some form of state government, regional, prefecture, province, whatever you call it, and we're much more like a country than a state, and we actually have states. Things that have that are more like states. Our sort of big regions are like states. I think that's in some ways a stronger identity. When I go outside the state, I don't tell people I'm from California, I say I'm from LA. And so, ultimately, big picture is a much smaller, diminished state government and having sort of regional governance, which is the true unit of citizenship in California, which is where a lot of our problems really need to be addressed, where I would say, in my lifetime, some of the greatest governmental successes have been regional successes, where there was cooperation regions or regional governments. The obvious one for a kid who grew up in Pasadena is with summers in the 1980s where I couldn't see Mount Wilson for long stretches of times, and the air is just cleaner. And I know that has a lot to do with regional governance. To me, that's the thing, and it's how we think about ourselves and the stories we tell ourselves and think about our problems. I think that's, regions could have different approaches. Regions have different economies, so they would make decisions better. And at least at a regional level, you would feel a connection and the ability to, it's in your media, you can track it, you can go visit it if you're upset. Sacramento is just too far. So, I think in that kind of setup and system that really reflected our size and scale and who we are, I would have more confidence in people. I think people would, in some ways, be better. They would get more of what they deserve, for better and for worse.
Okay, one last question.
Well, actually, it has to do with the regions. I spent a good deal of time in San Diego, which is the only political jurisdiction, the county of San Diego, which is also kind of a natural economic, transportation, and climate region of its own. When you look at the region that we're in currently, which runs from Ventura to Barstow, and has, I don't know what the Skag region has as a population anymore, tens of millions of people. You look at just the county of Los Angeles, how would you restructure that? I understand what you were saying about the state, but in Los Angeles County, we have 5 elected supervisors, each of whom has a population in his or her district that's larger than, I don't know, the smallest third of the states of the nation. How do you create the whatever governance system for the regions so that people have that representational, or do you cut up what is natural? Orange County and LA, the only way you can tell the difference is if you happen to see the sign go by on the freeway.
Right.
That's the only way you know you've gone from one
And
to
the
the
5
other.
gets a lot wider and better.
Well, when you get absolutely, No question about that. Orange County did it right. LA is
Yeah,
still, hiding
True.
and whatever. But how do you come up with a governance system where the 88 cities of Los Angeles County, some of whom have, 7 council members in a city of, 10 or 12,000, and others have, as assembly districts be damned, the city council districts in Los Angeles, of which there are 15, a
Yeah.
huge council, are much bigger than state senate districts. So how do you do that regional governance? That seems to be the real difficult part.
Well, see, I thought I could get away with this, but you've caught me out. The other side of going to the regional governance is that, gosh, this is the wrong crowd for this, but they're probably, while we have a distant state government, we have too many local governments that are small and weak. And so I would tend to argue that you would need an extinction event, a lot of consolidation on that level. Which is also very hard. But, ultimately, each of these regions would have to kind of make decisions for themselves about how they organized. I assume the IE would go off on its own. At least all my relatives there tell me they would, and they wouldn't want to be part of LA. I don't know if we could keep OC and Ventura with us, but I think there would have to be some consolidation on the local level. But, first, let's see if we can fix this sort of state stuff, and then we can start having our regional constitutional conventions. It's a big piece, but, it's the same problem that we have not reckoned with scale. We set county limits 100 years ago. We put in this rule 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, that there can only be 5 soups, in a county, except for San Francisco, which is always special, so, these are basic questions of scale that we have never dealt with, and that it just never enters the California conscience that all these decisions we made, a lot of really big decisions were made when we were not the same place we are. Even, you think of, Prop 13, we made that decision when there were 22 million of us, and now we're 38 million. We're a very, very different place than we were in 1978. We're a totally different place than we were when we adopted the initiative process in 1911 with 2.3 million people. So, the basics of scale and size, which are not part of the reform conversation and should be, we just have never dealt with that. We don't like to think about it. In every area we talk about in government spending and immigration, we don't deal with the fact that even in a time of slow growth like now, we're still adding 400,000 people a year, though most of them, come by the maternity ward rather than over one of the state's borders. But I hope that answers that.
Well, let's give Joe a great big hand. I think he did it very interesting.